The world of work has changed forever. Part 2. Factoryisation precedes Apace. In Part 1, I discussed how the world of work has changed forever. In Part 2, I will cover the threat side of this change, and go on in Part 3 to talk about the opportunity side of this change, or as I like to think of it, the antidote. In Part 2, I'm not interested in making some academic thesis here. There are always nuances, subtleties, exceptions, and complications. That's not the point. What I want to do is highlight what I see as a number of deep underlying currents which are driving the world of work right now. Pressures of modern life are leading to a tremendous amount of suffering. This can quite often remain hidden. Few these days, however, can be immune from the economic threats and consequent anxiety and depression surrounding them. Depression is apparently the most common condition the NHS treats. 1 in 4 in the UK will suffer mental health issues in a given year. Certainly the folks I know in psychotherapy are seeing boom times, although they themselves are increasingly subject to ever thicker rule books and rule-driven approaches that are the only ones that they're allowed to use. And surprise, surprise, what the nanny state prescribes as treatment options is not the best. It is interesting how we view mental imbalance as a society. In our society, in our so-called scientific age, we talk about neurochemical imbalances. Perhaps we might talk about our own thinking patterns, or family relationships, or personal history. In essence, though, if you're mentally ill, as it were, the fault is laid at your door. In doing so, however, any question of socially systemic causation is utterly swept under the carpet. It is hard to get statistics. They're not collected, as, of course, the system will not recognise a cause of depression as being the system itself. In Greece, suicides increased by 45% during the first 4 years of the financial crisis. Unemployment is a blight, ruining people's lives. At last count, there were 27 million unemployed in Europe and 11 million in the US alone. Just those two areas, that's 38 million. I can't conceive, I don't know about you, I can't conceive of 38 million people and all their pains and their suffering. 61% of Americans say they will work on their vacation. In the US, over the last century, the overall population grew 2.8 times. However, the prison population grew more than 20 times. Another statistic that I came across recently was that 9 in 10 prisoners have mental disorders. Moving on from the gross manifestations of society in terms of mental illness, unemployment and imprisonment, let's move on to how you sell yourself to the machine. By now we all accept the euphemism of tailoring our CVs to the particular job application. By which we mean, if we're looking for a job which is a circle, we make it look like the CV is full of circles. If we're looking for a job the following day for a square, we make it look like it's all been squares from the beginning. In essence, we're presenting ourselves as a component to the machine. Having been presented as a component, of course, it makes us all more replaceable because we just need to be replaced by another square. I'd like to quote from an excellent book by Ivor Southwood called Non-Stop Inertia. Ivor Southwood trained as a psychiatric nurse and makes some extremely pertinent remarks about how 21st century capitalism is moving. He says, "The burden is always on the worker to create the next opportunity and to surf between roles." A second quote in this context. "The emphasis upon self-promotion, the remaking of identity as CV material, and the masking of anxiety by an act of enthusiasm regarding whatever new generic role and costume is thrown at the individual." Moving on from how one presents oneself to the machine in order to get a job, let's now look at why the corporate middle ground is being squeezed out. Globalisation is taking cost-cutting to a new level of race to the bottom. I'll come back to why corporations keep cutting costs in a minute. That's very important. Sectors in the economy tend to move towards oligopolies. You don't need 100 oil companies. You don't need 100 big banks. Once you're an oligopoly, de facto you're a utility. Whether it's electricity, water, gas, banking, it's just a basic service, the main job of it. As firms get ever bigger and bigger, they get ever more bureaucratic. Ever more bureaucratic becomes ever more inhuman. Government regulation gets ever more complex and intrusive and creates barriers to entry at that level. Firms become more and more white-collar factories. Meanwhile, as Priestley argues, smaller firms are more nimble, agile and increasingly disintermediate the megacorps given the ease with which the internet links the buyer and seller. I'll repeat that. Meanwhile, smaller firms are more nimble, agile and increasingly disintermediate the big corporations given the ease with which the internet links the buyer and seller. You no longer need to be the company in the middle. Why corporations are turning their workers into robots, into battery hens. There is a documentary called The Corporation, which, interestingly enough, is called Canada's most successful documentary. That probably doesn't make you rush to write down the name of it and checking it out immediately. It's based on a book by Joel Bakan called The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power. It's won 26 international awards. The interesting point here is that what this guy has done is to apply the DSM, the American Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatric Evaluation, to the company. And in America, a company is a legal person, so it's perhaps more obvious to do it. I could give you my feeling, I could give you what the reviews say, but you might think it's a bit slanted. So I want to take what the Economist said, and it's the stalwart of free marketism and pro-business. So you might expect that it takes the film apart. Let me read what the Economist says about the corporation. It says, "To the anti-globalizers, the corporation is a devilish instrument of environmental destruction, class oppression, and imperial conquest. But is it also pathologically insane? That is the provocative conclusion of an award-winning documentary called The Corporation. People on both sides of the globalisation debate should pay attention. Unlike much of the soggy thinking peddled by too many anti-globalisers, the corporation is a surprisingly rational and coherent attack on capitalism's most important institution." The answer elicited over 2.5 hours of interviews with left-wing intellectuals, right-wing captains of industry, economists, psychologists and philosophers is that the corporation is a psychopath. Like all psychopaths, the firm is singularly self-interested. Its purpose is to create wealth for its shareholders, and like all psychopaths, the firm is irresponsible because it puts others at risk to satisfy its profit-maximising goal, harming employees and customers and damaging the environment. The corporation manipulates everything. It is grandiose, always insisting that it is the best or number one. It has no empathy, refuses to accept responsibility for its actions, and feels no remorse. It relates to others only superficial, via make-believe versions of itself, brackets think spin, brackets, manufactured by PR consultants and marketing men. In short, if the metaphor of the firm as a person is a valid one, then the corporation is clinically insane. Now let's just go back over that. That is The Economist, a business magazine, and what they're talking about there is the application of the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatrists in America, as applied to the corporation. The book and the documentary take you through it, and then you can see from that that technically the corporation as it's currently conceived is in essence psychopathic. Now, of course, that is not to say that all corporations are psychopathic. That's just to say that the way the corporation is structured, this ever-increasing pursuit of profit, no amount of profit is ever good enough for the corporation. Indeed, it's got a duty to want more. No amount of profit seemingly these days is ever good enough for the stock market. It's got to get more and more profit. When the revenue growth slows down, what can it do? It can just keep cutting costs, keep cutting costs. But this is all very inhuman. Nothing about this has anything to do with people. If we think about it, we take a step back for a second, there are only people on the planet, apart from the animals and the trees. But in terms of economics, there's only people. How do we regain our humanity from these abstract machine ways of being that we've created? The first point is to realise that like a fish swimming in water, we don't notice it. Tens of thousands of years of brain development have led to a frontal cortex that can treat abstractions as real things. So we are wired to fall for being consumed by our own inhuman creation, by the Frankenculture we have created. In the short term, it's simple. If you set up a company tomorrow, just do as you would be done by. Treat your staff as people. And I'm sure everyone would do that to the best of their abilities. The problem is that this gets so much worse with scale. With scale comes more abstraction, more rules, more bureaucracy. Let's take the NHS as just one example. I read recently that nearly half of NHS workers have witnessed bullying in the past 6 months, and 20% been victims. That's staggering. 1 in 4 workers is now a bureaucrat in the NHS. Let me be clear, I'm not blaming people in bureaucratic jobs in the slightest. They act like the rest of us with the best of intents they can muster on a given day. However, I am pointing out the unreality and ultimately inhumanity of abstractions. It's why judges have sentencing discretion, albeit these days that's shrinking too. To wrap up this part, we just need to wake up to the way that right now we live our lives in a culture defined by ever-increasing amounts of abstraction. Laws, rules, regulation, far from being the answer to error and inhumanity they purport to be. Ironically, all these efforts to control end up becoming the disease for which they are allegedly the cure. We can make good use of abstractions of all sorts, but we must never let them become our masters. Interestingly enough, there was a gentleman who was born in 1864 who got all this completely right. And Max Weber was one of the founders of sociology, like Karl Marx I mentioned earlier. He was completely right. In particular, he made 3 comments which seemed to me to be absolutely accurate about the early 21st century, and this guy was born 2 centuries ago. The first was rationalisation. Rationalisation is the process whereby an increasing number of social actions become based on considerations of teleological efficiency, i.e. looking after the ends rather than the means, or calculation, rather than on motivations derived from morality, emotion, custom, or tradition. The second is iron cage. It refers to the increased rationalisation inherent in social life. The iron cage thus traps individuals in systems based purely on teleological efficiency, rational calculation and control. The third point, and these things obviously relate, disenchantment. A bureaucratic, scientifically driven, secular culture striving towards rational goals and devaluing any mysticism. So these points, rationalisation, iron cage and disenchantment, frankly, they sum up most of the people I've been meeting recently in London to a greater or lesser degree. What people really want is escape. What people really want is some reconnection with their creative side, with some feeling of the mystery of the fact that we're just all here in the first place. Fortunately, antidotes often grow up around the problems they're there for. In the next and final part of The World of Work Has Changed Forever, I will talk about how there's a new golden age of empowerment and creativity.